I walk around, gun on my waist, chip on my shoulder till I buzz a clip in your face. This beef ain't over, many man. Wish death upon me, Lord. I don't cry no more. Don't look to the sky no more. Have mercy on me. Have mercy on my soul. Have mercy on many men. Many men, many, many men. Wish death upon me.
This is Grief Between the Lines. This isn't a podcast about getting over anything. It's about what lives in the space between what's said and what's lived, between memory and love, between survival and understanding. So if you're here, I'm sorry, but welcome. You don't need to be ready for anything. You don't need the language for your grief. You can just listen. See, I've been writing for most of my life. Not because I planned to be a writer, but because writing was where things could exist without being corrected. When I was young, I was gifted a journal, and at the time it felt small, ordinary. I didn't know it would become the place where everything would go when there was nowhere else for it to go. I wrote what I couldn't say. I wrote what didn't make sense yet. I wrote when adults moved on faster than I could. I wrote when silence felt heavier than the noise. Over time, my journal stacked up, years of them. Moments recorded without knowing what they would eventually mean. Grief didn't enter my life as a single event. It unfolded. It lingered. It repeated itself in many different forms. And the writing has stayed with me through all of it. Not to explain what happened, but just to witness it. I'm going to read a few lines I wrote years ago. I learned early that memory doesn't ask for permission and grief doesn't wait for the right language. It arrives and it just asks, where can I sit? This segment is brought to you by Mark My Words Foundation, where leaving your mark means using your voice, your work, and your values to shape the future. Founded in honor of Marquita Christie, the foundation invests in future lawyers committed to meaningful change in the justice system. He was a fighter. Before he was anyone's brother, cousin, friend, nephew, uncle, or father, he was a fighter because he lived. His hard-headed, super simplistic ways tuned out the drumming, the sound waves of the non-believers. Because to some, he was nothing. But to us, he was everything. He was a fighter. See, I remembered being plucked from my bed, and for the first time I saw that the moon and this luminescent red oblivion sun could both meet and linger in the sky to grace us with deep passionate purples and exuberant pinks. We were off onto his battleship of unexpectancies, where we glided on glassy water-top surfaces and mists of wisdom hit my face only to be wiped away with my childhood tendencies. We went fishing. There was this game we played, he and I, where we'd whisper long distances to each other, and I'd smile because I loved him this much, with arms stretched wide, and he loved me from the moon to the sun and back. He said my smile was gonna save his life. Together we climbed goose down mountains, drifting in and out of reality. And in my head he filled dreams, and so it seems, without realizing, he painted my thumb green. He planted me in his garden. So from birth, I have always had a strawberry-shaped heart. I am the product of his presence. See, they may not know this, but my mouth still waters from that moment where we sat and shared sweet red ripened berries, palms permanently stained red as though from blood. We were always partners in crime. He told me that everything has a season, but those words always rubbed me the wrong way, so I treated it like it was a thesis. I broke it down into little bits and pieces, but I still didn't understand. He said he was always a fighter before he was anyone's brother, cousin, friend, nephew, uncle, or my father. He was a fighter until he met his match, but he promised me he wasn't quite ready to meet his maker. He counted every breath, saving them so he could still train his stubborn baby soldier. See, this is where poetry meets scripture. Because God, I tried to develop bad thoughts into a positive picture. They said cancer has no cure, but they still radiated his veins. And for years, I searched for the words to try to alleviate his pains. He taught me how to paint pictures using images from my past, but I found myself just begging God, please don't make time go too fast because he's my father. And though winding images of hospital hallways fill my head, I still find that I'm fighting. Before I learned to fight for myself, I had to learn to fight for us both. But together, as masters of our own universal gardens, together we'll stand rooted, and together we'll fight. We often talk about loss as something that suddenly happens, like this particular moment, this sharp dividing line, but sometimes grief just comes after a long season of preparation that we did not consent to. And the groundwork for it is laid very quietly until it arrives. And it's through instability, through vigilance, through learning how to read a room too well. Loss doesn't always shatter something perfect. Sometimes it cracks here and there in something that was already under pressure. And naming something such as grief before it comes is really hard to do, but it helps us understand why it arrives at our doorstep the way that it does. This podcast exists because grief doesn't end when the world expects it to. It doesn't resolve when a certain amount of time passes, and it doesn't disappear just because we learned how to function again on some level. We're always taught to look for closure, for arc, for a healing narrative, and it lands somewhere between hopeful and clean and the messiest fucking part of your life. Grief does not do that. Grief becomes a companion. Grief is something that changes shape every day. Something that changes how you love, how you trust, how you move through the world. Between the lines of our lives, there are stories that we don't know how to tell out loud. Stories that don't belong in speeches, in summaries, or told in front of a jury. Sometimes we have stories that just need room to breathe so we can learn how to breathe again. This is a space for those stories. Much of what I'll share along this season is things that I've written in my journals, poems that I've written throughout the course of my life, and some stories that have never been written on page but deserve to be told on air. We often talk about loss as this big arrival, this major moment, like a sharp dividing line of before and after, but sometimes grief doesn't just arrive. Sometimes it's been living with you for a very, very long time. It lives in your home. It quietly rearranges your furniture. It teaches you where to sleep, not to sleep too heavy. Sometimes grief shows up only after something ends, even though your nervous system has been preparing for it for years. There are losses that come with sirens and hospital rooms and phone calls that you will never, ever forget. And then there are the losses that come after these long stretches of uncertainty, these long, long stretches of just holding your damn breath, learning how to stay alert without looking afraid, of knowing that something isn't right, but not having the language for it yet. That kind of grief does not start with loss or death itself. It starts way earlier. It starts with the inconsistency, the hypervigilance that becomes second nature, and in the way you learn to read a room oh too well. You notice the tone shifts, and you sense when things are about to change before everyone else does. You anticipate the reactions before they happen, and that preparation wasn't something that you agreed to. It wasn't chosen. It was something you learned because you had to. Death doesn't always shatter something perfect. Sometimes it cracks something that was already under pressure. And sometimes grief isn't just about what ends, but about everything you carried while it was still there. The waiting, the adapting, the emotional math you were doing long before anyone called it trauma or stress or survival. And naming the before doesn't undo the grief. It doesn't make it hurt any less, any clean or immediate way. But I guess it does give the pain some context, and context does matter, sort of. Because without it, we tell ourselves stories that aren't true. We wonder why we're still affected, why we didn't just bounce back, why something that ended months or years ago still has this heavy weight on our bodies. And understanding the before helps explain why the loss landed the way that it did, why it settled where it did, and why the pain still echoes. This podcast exists because grief does not end when the world expects it to. It does not resolve because enough time has passed, and it doesn't disappear because we learned how to function again. Functioning is not the same as healing, and productivity is not proof of closure. Smiling does not mean that the weight of the pain is gone. See, we're always taught to look for closure, for these hero arcs, for stories that wrap themselves up neatly and land somewhere between hopeful and expiring. We're taught that healing should look like progress, like improvement, like a clear narrative with lessons learned and the strength we've gained. But grief does not fucking do that. Most grief doesn't move in a straight line. It doesn't follow a particular timeline built by society. It doesn't care how much work you've done on yourself or on your friends or on your family. It doesn't disappear just because you start to understand it intellectually. That shit lingers. It takes shape. It shows up in unexpected moments, in relationships, in your decision making, and how safe or unsafe the world feels. Most grief becomes your companion. Not always out loud, but always present in the same way, but there, informing you how love, how trust, and how attachments are going to forever change. How you leave and how you stay. It shows up in the questions you ask yourself, in the pauses before you answer other people, in the way you scan for exits, in the way your body responds before your mind even has time to catch up. Between the lines of our lives, there are these stories we don't know how to tell out loud. Stories that don't belong in some big speech or summary. A story that doesn't fit into the captions or the conversations that allow for a few sentences before things start to get uncomfortable. Some experiences do not translate well into small talk. And to be honest, most of that shit doesn't. Some truths don't survive being rushed. Some grief needs room. It needs slowness. It needs permission to exist without being fixed or reframed as healing. And this is a space for those stories. Not the polished version, not the version that makes sense to everyone else, but the ones that live underneath. The ones that surface late at night, the ones that show up in your journals and the half-finished thoughts and moments that you replay over and over and over and over again. See, much of what I'll share here lives alongside of my journals and my writing. My journals are where I've always gone to tell the truth without worrying about how it sounds or being corrected. They hold the raw drafts of my understanding as a child, the questions I didn't have the answers to yet, the emotions I wasn't ready to name publicly. Some of those stories belong on a page. They needed to stay quiet. They needed the privacy, the ability to be revisited time and time again. Because writing allows distance, it allows reflection, it allows time to shape something slowly. Some stories belong on the air. They need to breathe. They need tone. They need pause. They need to be spoken the way they were lived, with the hesitation, with emphasis, and with space between sentences. And I think audio carries what text sometimes can't. That weight of silence, the tremor in a voice, and the moments where words just don't come out as easily. This podcast sits in between that space, between the pages of my journals and the air, between what's written and what's felt, between what we know happened and what we're still trying to understand about how it changed us. I'm not here to offer any tidy answers. I'm not here to tell you how to heal or how long it should take. I'm not interested in pretending that grief is a problem that we need to solve. I'm more interested in sitting with it and listening to it and letting it speak without being interrupted. If you're here, chances are you've carried something longer than people realize. Maybe longer than you expected yourself to. Maybe you've been told you're strong so many times that no one even checks on you anymore. Maybe you've learned how to explain your pain in ways that make other people feel comfortable, even when it isn't the full truth. You don't have to do that here. Here we can talk about the slow losses, anticipatory grief, the grief that comes from environments, not just events, the grief that doesn't have a clear beginning or end, the grief that coexists with love, relief, anger, guilt, gratitude, and longing all at once. It feels important to say where all of this is coming from because I really do understand grief on a very deep and personal level. You see, my story begins in 2017. My family gathered for Thanksgiving dinner. My sister and I had carpooled back to our hometown, each of us with our dogs in tow. We listened to music the entire drive, and at some point she rolled down the windows, something I rarely would have done, and we just let the air move through the car. We were happy to be going home. It was the first Thanksgiving since we'd both moved into our own apartments, and being back together felt significant. At the house, we danced in the kitchen to NSYNC's Merry Christmas song and playfully argued while Mom cooked. When it was time to eat, the four of us gathered around the table and shared what we were thankful for. And that year, our gratitude was simple. We were thankful to be home, thankful to be together, thankful to not be spending another holiday in the hospital. Because for years that had been part of our routine, so it was always mentioned when we said grace. This time, everyone was there, everyone was healthy, everyone was happy. It was the last time my family was all together. 4 days later, I received a call that my sister collapsed at work. She was taken to the emergency room and pronounced deceased. She was only 30 years old, and there had been no warning that something like this was coming. Weeks later, an autopsy showed that she died from a blood clot that traveled from her leg up to her heart, deep vein thrombosis. The probable cause was the hormonal birth control pills she had started taking only months earlier. A decision that was meant to help her live her best life and focus on herself ended her life instead. She was my only sibling. Her death was sudden, unexpected, heartbreaking, and final. Only a few months later, my dad died. He had been diagnosed with a very rare blood cancer in 2002, and after chemotherapy, full body radiation, a bone marrow transplant, overcoming graft versus host disease, and surviving 3 strokes, he lived in remission for over 10 years. Even after being told he had less than 2 years to live, he still continued on. He beat cancer. What he could not survive was the loss of his first child. His death was slow. He slipped away over time, losing parts of himself along the way. I learned what it feels like to grieve something taken instantly and something that fades right in front of you. After my sister died, and then my dad, life didn't pause long enough to catch up to what had happened. Things kept moving, funeral arrangements, paperwork, decisions that had to be made while nothing else inside me felt steady enough to choose anything. There were meetings, phone calls, forms that needed my signature, questions that assumed I had answers for, expectations that I could show up, respond, organize, give speeches, and explain. There were stories. Everyone had one. Everyone needed to tell me how they knew them, what they meant to them, where they were when they heard. I listened. I nodded. I held space for it, even when I didn't have anything left to give. I carried the weight of everyone else's grief while barely understanding my own. I watched people measure their closeness to the deceased out loud, as if proximity could be proven, as if love needed witnesses. I watched grief turn competitive, territorial, loud, combative. Then came the unannounced visits. People stopping by without asking, without warning, without understanding how fragile everything in my life had become. Conversations I did not have the energy to participate in, and comfort that didn't feel comforting at all. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it all stopped. People went back to their lives, back to the routines and obligations and distractions. The check-ins stopped. The visits ended. The world moved on. And I was still there, stuck in the aftermath, in the quiet, in a life that looked the same on the outside, but felt unrecognizable from the inside. And after the visit stopped, after all the messages slowed, after the world moved on, I had to sit in the silence with a version of myself that no longer matched the one I'd been living. And time stopped making sense. Days dragged on, days went by fast. Years somehow disappeared at the same time. Everything felt slow and rushed all at once. You see, you move forward because you have to. You go to work, you pay bills, you answer questions, you learn how to say I'm fine or I'm not fine without thinking about it. And somewhere in the middle of all that, time keeps passing without asking for your permission. You're not ready to move on just because time is passing. And then one day you look up and you realize years have gone by in the way that just sneaks up on you, and you're still there, but you're different. You're awake to it in a way that you weren't before. And now, here you are, carrying the trauma of what happened, the pain of it all, even as everything and everyone keeps moving. My listeners are always welcome to share their own memories or journal excerpts or just moments of grief that have shaped them. Submissions may be included anonymously in future episodes. I can't wait to hear what some of you have to share. To share your stories, feel free to email me at hello@Whitney Christie, subject line, grief between the lines. Thanks again for listening. Take care of yourself in whatever way you need to today, and I'll meet you here again next week. Bye.